The gusts of wind whistled through the trees as the storm rolled in over the English countryside, its dark clouds tumbling in from the west. It was late September, and the year was 1890. The scent of rain mixed with the earthy smell of the surrounding woods, a promise of the fierce weather to come. Catherine, head maid at a modest cottage nestled on the edge of the village, had long grown accustomed to the unpredictable whims of nature, but nothing could prepare her for what she would find that night. She had been tidying the hearth when a sharp knock echoed through the small, humble room. At first, she hesitated, unsure if it was a traveler seeking shelter from the storm or merely a stray animal outside. The rain began to fall in sheets, the wind rattling the cottage's windows. Another knock came, more insistent this time. Catherine's heart quickened. She wasn't expecting anyone, but it was her duty to help. She threw on her shawl and stepped to the door, pulling it open with a creak. The gust of wind nearly knocked her back, and there, lying on her doorstep, was a man. He was unconscious, his dark hair wet and matted to his forehead, his fine clothes soaked through by the downpour. His face was pale, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. A chill ran down Catherine's spine. She quickly knelt beside him, her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't hesitate. His feverish heat told her that he needed care, immediate care. She shifted him onto his back with effort, feeling the weight of him as she gently lifted his head. His body felt strangely heavy, as though the man was more than he appeared. The soft glow of the cottage lantern cast flickering shadows on his face as she carefully pulled him inside, shutting the door against the raging storm outside. Inside the warm cottage, the storm seemed far away. Catherine's mind moved swiftly, taking charge of the situation. She removed his wet outer coat, noticing the fine fabric that suggested he wasn't just any traveler. The expensive cut of his clothing, the polished boots, and the scent of cologne unfamiliar to her suggested wealth and status. But these things didn't matter. What mattered was that he needed help. Catherine's hands were steady as she worked. She wrapped him in a dry blanket and gathered the small supplies she kept on hand for emergencies. Herbs, water, and a few bottles of medicine she had learned to use from her years of serving in the village. Her background wasn't noble, but her skills were sharp and her heart was kind. Catherine had been a maid since she was young, but it was a practical knowledge she'd gained over the years that made her more than just an ordinary servant. His breathing grew more labored, and Catherine's mind raced. She could tell from his feverish state that the man's condition was serious. His body trembled beneath the covers, and his forehead was burning with the heat of illness. She murmured soft reassurances to him, though he could not hear. As a child, Catherine had learned to care for the sick, often nursing neighbors back to health when no one else would. It was a skill that had kept her grounded in her humble life. But now, in this moment, it felt like a calling. As the night deepened, Catherine stayed by his side, applying cool cloths to his forehead and changing them when they grew warm. Her hands were steady, but her mind wandered. Who was this stranger? What was he doing here, on her doorstep, in the middle of such a storm? His clothes didn't fit the image of a common traveler. No, he seemed out of place in the small, sleepy village. She could only wonder what had brought him here and why, out of all the places in the countryside, he had collapsed at her door. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, only to close again. His feverish mutterings were incoherent. A name? Perhaps, but it was too soft to understand. Catherine frowned but continued to work, her hands never leaving his side. She whispered softly, trying to comfort him, though she knew he couldn't hear her. There was something about him, a sense of vulnerability that stirred something deep within her. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This man was in need of her care, and she would not let him down. Hours passed in the quiet of the storm, and Catherine's eyelids grew heavy. She had long since abandoned the notion of sleep. Her focus was on the man's labored breaths and his sweat-soaked brow. She could feel his temperature rise and fall, each fluctuation adding to her growing concern. Yet there was something in the air, a subtle pull, a connection that made her stay. Catherine glanced at the small window, where the storm still raged. The world outside felt distant, as if it no longer mattered. All that mattered was the man in her care. She stayed beside him, tending to his needs through the night, determined to save him. She had always been a woman of resolve. her heart kind but her strength unyielding. The storm would pass, she told herself. And so, too, would this man's fever. He would survive, and when he awoke, Catherine would be there to offer him the help he so desperately needed. In that moment, she didn't know who he was or why he had come. All she knew was that she would do everything in her power to save him. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, the warmth of the cottage wrapped around them both. Catherine's heart pounded with the uncertainty of the night, but she remained by his side, steadfast. She had no way of knowing what the future held, but one thing was certain. This was a beginning, and it would change both of their lives forever. 3 days passed, and still the storm raged outside, its relentless winds battering the cottage. Inside, the fire crackled on the hearth, casting a soft glow across the room where Catherine sat by the bed of the man she had found on her doorstep. His fever had not broken, and her concern deepened with every passing hour. He was a stranger, someone who had collapsed into her life out of nowhere, yet she found herself caring for him as if he were a long-lost friend. Each day, she administered her remedies, making sure his body temperature didn't spiral into something worse, all the while whispering quiet reassurances to him even though he could not hear. His feverish mumblings, though incoherent, often seemed to carry a sense of longing, a hint of something deeper than mere illness. Catherine had seen the way people talked in their sleep, but there was something in his words that stirred something within her. She could never make out a full sentence, but there were moments when he said something that almost sounded like a name she couldn't grasp. It was maddening to not know who he was, but it also kept her grounded in her care for him, keeping her focus sharp as she nursed him back to health. On the second day of his fever, Catherine found herself sitting by the bed more often than before, her hands gentle as she wiped his brow with cool cloths. She would sit in silence for hours, only the sound of the storm outside and his labored breathing filling the room. Yet, in those moments of stillness, Catherine found herself lost in thought, her mind drifting to the past. She wasn't just a maid, she was a survivor. Orphaned at a young age, she had been raised in a village that had little to offer but hard work. She had taught herself to read and write, learning from the books of travelers and whatever scraps of education she could find. She had never been taught the finer things of the world, but she had a sharp mind, one that didn't need titles or wealth to make sense of the world around her. Catherine had always believed that character was the true measure of a person, not their social standing. But as she sat by the bed, watching the stranger, this man whose name she didn't even know, she couldn't help but wonder who he was. What had he been doing before the storm had brought him to her door? He had the manner of someone with money, with education, and yet he had not revealed his full identity to her. Was he ashamed of it? Was he testing her? These questions gnawed at her as she worked, but she didn't allow them to distract her. Her job was simple: save him. She had seen so much suffering in her life, but she had also seen the strength that came from caring for others. It was what kept her going, what had allowed her to make it this far. As night fell on the third day, Catherine noticed a slight change in the man's condition. His fever was still high, but it was not as intense as before. His breathing, though still shallow, was more regular. She dared to hope that the worst was behind him. She had been working tirelessly, but her body ached from the long hours and lack of sleep. Still, she couldn't bring herself to leave his side. He needed her, and somehow she knew she couldn't abandon him now, not when she'd come so far. His fever broke later that night, and Catherine could finally breathe a sigh of relief. She had done it. She had saved him. The storm outside began to subside, and the wind that had howled so fiercely now seemed like a distant memory. The first rays of dawn filtered through the small window, casting a soft light across the room. It was in that quiet moment that the man's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize where he was. His gaze was unfocused, and his brow furrowed in confusion as he took in his surroundings. Catherine stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been so focused on caring for him, so wrapped up in her work, that she hadn't expected this moment. She had been so sure that he was just a stranger, someone who had come into her life for a brief time. But now, she felt a strange connection to him. He was awake, and he would want answers. "You're safe," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "You've been ill, but the fever is broken. You're going to be fine." He blinked a few times, still dazed, as if trying to make sense of her words. For a moment, he just stared at her, as though unsure whether to trust her. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand to his forehead, groaning slightly at the weight of the movement. "Where am I?" he asked hoarsely, his voice barely a whisper. "In my cottage," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "You collapsed outside. I brought you in and have been taking care of you." He nodded faintly, still disoriented, but something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of recognition? She couldn't be sure. His gaze seemed to sharpen, and he fixed her with a questioning look. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. Catherine hesitated, then offered a small smile. "I'm Catherine, a maid in the village, head maid at the cottage." He nodded, though it seemed like he was only half listening, his mind still clouded by the fever. But there was something in his eyes, something that made her wonder if he was testing her, trying to gauge her reaction. She had no idea who he was, no idea of the life he had left behind. He still hadn't given her his full name, and for some reason, Catherine didn't press him. It didn't matter. Not now. All that mattered was that he was awake, and he was going to be all right. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful, and for a second, Catherine felt a strange weight between them. She couldn't explain it, but something told her that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This man was different, and whatever lay ahead would change both their lives. She forced herself to look away, not wanting to let her thoughts run wild. There was no place for those feelings right now. The storm had passed, and the world outside had returned to calm. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the storm inside her was only just beginning. When Alexander's eyes finally fluttered open, the world around him was a haze of unfamiliar faces and soft, muted sounds. His head throbbed, and his limbs felt weak and heavy, as if he'd been submerged in a dream for far too long. The first thing he noticed was the warmth of the room, the scent of fresh herbs and with smoke drifting in the air, the soft rustle of the fire in the hearth. It was a far cry from the cold, relentless storm outside, and he couldn't help but wonder how he had ended up here. His gaze shifted slowly, landing on the woman sitting beside him. She was young, with soft brown eyes that held both a warmth and a quiet strength. She looked down at him with a kind expression, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though there was a tension in her posture that spoke of sleepless nights. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice a gentle balm to his aching head. He tried to speak, but his throat felt dry, cracked. His mind was still a blur, and the memories of the past few days came rushing back slowly. "Where am I?" he croaked, his voice hoarse. She smiled slightly, a trace of something sad in her eyes. "You're safe?" she replied. "You've been ill. This is my cottage. I found you outside in the storm." The mention of the storm made something stir inside him, a vague memory of a sudden downpour, of pain, of falling. His mind seized up as his heart raced, trying to grasp at the fleeting images that came and went like shadows. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice stronger now, his confusion fading. Catherine hesitated for a moment before answering, her gaze steady but guarded. "I'm Catherine, a maid here in the village," she said, her words simple but purposeful, as if there was no need to say anything more. "I'm the head maid here. I've been taking care of you." He studied her for a moment longer, his mind trying to piece together the details. She was kind, no doubt, and there was something in the way she spoke that made him feel comforted. But the words "head maid" lingered in his mind, and a question began to form. "You're a maid?" he asked, his brow furrowing in surprise. Catherine nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, I've been in service most of my life. It's a hard life, but it's honest." She said it without any bitterness, but her words carried a weight of experience. Alexander's gaze softened as he took in her simple attire, a plain dress and a shawl draped over her shoulders, and the warmth of the room seemed to shift as the recognition of her position settled in. He had never known a life like hers, and yet there was a certain grace in the way she held herself, a dignity that transcended her station. "I can't remember much," he said slowly, trying to gather his scattered thoughts. "How long have I been here?" Catherine's eyes softened, and she reached for a cloth to dab his forehead, though there was no fever left. 3 days, she said gently. "You were very ill. It was touch and go there for a while. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. 3 days. He had been unconscious for 3 days, and this woman, this maid, had cared for him the entire time. There was something both humbling and disorienting about that. His mind wandered to the few fragments of memory that remained, the storm, the pain, the fear, but it was all hazy, like trying to grasp smoke with his bare hands. "You saved me," he said quietly, though it felt like an understatement. She gave a small, dismissive shrug, as though it was no great feat. "I did what I could," she said simply. "I'm just glad you're better." Her modesty struck him, and in that moment, he realized just how little he knew about her. He had been unconscious for days, but she had been here, watching over him. Her care had been quiet but constant, and there was something deeply compelling about the way she moved through the world. He wanted to ask more, wanted to know about her, her life, what had brought her to this small cottage, but he hesitated. There was a distance between them that was hard to ignore. She was a maid, and he didn't know who he was anymore. His memories were fractured, but his identity as Alexander Thornton, the Duke of Ashford, seemed far away, like a life he no longer recognized. For now, he was simply a man who had been saved by a stranger. It wasn't until later, when the silence stretched between them, that the truth began to settle in. He knew he had to tell her. He couldn't lie to her any longer. But something held him back, some instinct deep inside telling him to wait. Maybe it was because he didn't want to lose the simplicity of this connection. Maybe it was because he feared what would happen when she learned the truth. She had shown him kindness when he had no name, no title, and no expectations. She had seen him as just a man, nothing more, and that was something he hadn't felt in years. In the quiet that followed, Catherine busied herself with small tasks around the room, her movements graceful and steady, as though nothing had changed. But Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something important was unfolding between them. He wasn't sure what it was, only that he didn't want it to end. He had to tell her who he was. He knew that, but the timing was delicate. For now, he would wait. He would be the man she thought him to be, a simple stranger in need of care. And maybe, just maybe, he would find out who Catherine truly was as well. The week that followed was filled with quiet moments and small, shared discoveries between Catherine and Alexander. Each day, as the storm outside gave way to clear skies, Alexander's strength returned, but so did the discomfort of their situation. He had been bedridden for so long, and now that he was slowly regaining his strength, he found himself increasingly restless. Catherine, ever the patient caretaker, moved with practiced grace around the cottage, attending to her duties with quiet efficiency. As he sat up the first time, her eyes studied him carefully, noticing the way his broad shoulders tensed as he tried to stretch. "You should take it easy," Catherine advised, her voice soft but firm. Alexander gave a faint smile, his eyes still a bit clouded by the lingering effects of the fever. "I'll take your advice, but I can't stay in this bed forever." His tone was playful, though there was an underlying tension, an eagerness to return to a life he no longer quite understood. "You've had enough rest. It's time I learned to walk again." Catherine chuckled at his light-heartedness, though her concern for his recovery was always at the forefront. "You're not a child. You'll regain your strength in time. But for now, perhaps you should stick to less strenuous activities." She helped him to his feet, steadying him as he took a few hesitant steps. He stumbled slightly, and Catherine had to catch him, her hands firm against his chest. It was a brief, intimate moment, and both of them felt the electricity of it. Her hands on him, his close proximity, but neither of them spoke of it. Instead, Alexander grinned sheepishly. "It seems I've forgotten how to walk." Catherine shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's not as easy as it looks, is it?" As the days went by, their time together seemed to follow a rhythm, a balance between care and companionship that was both comforting and strange. There were moments when Alexander would try to help around the cottage, fetching firewood or attempting to clean, but his efforts were always clumsy. He was used to a different life, one of servants and ease, but here, in this small cottage, he was reminded of how little he knew about the world Catherine had inhabited for so long. Catherine, with her quiet authority, was a natural teacher, showing him how to do simple tasks with patience and humor. They laughed together at his fumbling attempts, and with each laugh, Alexander felt something in him shift. He had always lived a life surrounded by privilege, where every action was carefully controlled, but here, with Catherine, there was no pretense. There was only genuine connection, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. She taught him how to prepare a meal, how to sweep the floors, how to tend the fire, and with each task, he found himself marveling at the quiet strength she possessed. She didn't need to be a duchess to command respect. Her wisdom and kindness were enough to make anyone feel that they had found a sanctuary in her presence. And it wasn't just a mundane task that drew him closer to her. Their conversation, though simple, felt profound. They spoke of their lives, of dreams of the future. Catherine shared stories of her childhood, how she had been orphaned at a young age, how she had taught herself to read and write. She spoke of the hardships of her life, but she never once complained. She valued the simple things, the beauty of the countryside, the joy of teaching the local children, the quiet moments spent with those she loved. In turn, Alexander spoke of his own life, though he never revealed the full truth. He told her of his family, his childhood, and the responsibilities that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was a man of duty, he said, and the weight of his title was something that he couldn't escape, no matter how much he might want to. Yet even in his words, Catherine could hear a longing, a desire to be something more than what society had defined him to be. The contrast between them was striking. She, a maid with no grand title, and he, a duke with all the trappings of wealth and power. Yet in their shared moments, it was clear that neither of them cared for such distinctions. They were two people just trying to make sense of their place in the world. Catherine's patience and warmth had softened the sharp edges of Alexander's life, and in turn, he had become her anchor in a world that had often felt lonely. It was during one of their many conversations that Alexander finally felt the need to address something that had been lingering in the back of his mind since the moment he had woken up in her cottage. "Catherine," he began, his voice soft but earnest, "I know I haven't been completely honest with you." Catherine looked up from where she had been tending to the fire, her brow furrowing in concern. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone wary. Alexander hesitated, his gaze drifting to the small window where the evening sun was beginning to dip behind the hills. "I haven't told you who I really am," he said quietly. Catherine's heart skipped a beat, but she held her ground, her voice steady. "I don't care who you are," she replied. "You've been nothing but kind to me. That's all that matters." Alexander smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "You deserve to know," he said. "I'm not just any man. I'm Alexander Thornton, the Duke of Ashford." The words hung between them, and for a moment, Catherine's world seemed to freeze. She had known, deep down, that there was something about him that didn't fit, his manner, his clothing, the way he carried himself. But hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a cold wave crashing over her. She had been treating him like an equal, as if he were just a man, nothing more. And now, the truth was out. He was a duke. The revelation hit her hard, harder than she had expected. Her mind raced as she tried to process the new information, the sudden widening gap between their worlds. But even as the walls of society seemed to rise between them, a small part of her wondered if it would matter. Could it matter? The days went on, and the quiet bond between them remained, unbroken by titles or rank. But for Catherine, the truth had settled uneasily in her heart. She had fallen for him, the man in her care, but now she had to wonder, had he fallen for her, the maid, or for the woman he thought she was? The week was coming to an end, and Catherine could feel the weight of what lay ahead. The storm had passed, but a new one, a much more complicated one, was just beginning. The day the Dowager Duchess arrived at the cottage, the sky was overcast, the air heavy with an unspoken tension that matched the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Catherine had been tidying the small kitchen when she heard the sound of horses' hooves and the creak of a carriage approaching the cottage. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't immediately recognize the visitor. She opened the door, only to be met with the imposing figure of a woman in elegant black attire, her posture straight, her expression stern. Behind her, a small entourage of servants stood waiting, and the woman's presence seemed to carry with a cold air of authority. "Catherine, I presume?" the woman asked, her voice sharp but polished. Catherine nodded, her throat tightening with instinctive wariness. "Yes, ma'am. How may I help you?" The Dowager Duchess didn't answer immediately, but instead swept her gaze over Catherine, as if measuring her worth. "I am the Dowager Duchess of Ashford," she finally said, her tone unwavering, "and I am here for my son." Catherine's breath caught in her chest. "Your son?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Dowager Duchess gave a thin smile, her eyes narrowing. "Alexander Thornton, the Duke of Ashford. Perhaps you know him by a different name." At the mention of his full title, Catherine's heart lurched, and her blood ran cold. Alexander, the man she had cared for, who had shared so much with her, who had treated her as an equal, was a duke. The realization hit her like a hammer, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The woman's words had cut through a fragile world she had built in these past few days, shattering it with the weight of an undeniable truth. The Dowager Duchess stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Catherine. "My son has been quite careless," she continued with disdain. "He's played at being a common man, but he is a duke, and I won't have him wasting his time here, in a place like this." Catherine's mind was reeling, but she held her ground, her posture stiffening with a mix of disbelief and hurt. "I don't understand," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Why didn't he tell me? Why the deceit?" The Dowager Duchess gave a sharp laugh, a sound that was cold and cruel. "Why indeed? Perhaps he enjoyed the illusion of being a common man for a time. Perhaps he thought he could find some semblance of normalcy away from the constraints of his title. But we both know that is impossible." Catherine felt the ground beneath her feet shift, her heart aching as the reality of the situation sank in. She had known, somewhere deep inside, that Alexander was different from the men she had known in the village, that he was something more. But this was a blow she hadn't expected. She had treated him like any other man, caring for him without regard for his status. And now, it seemed, she had been nothing more than a temporary distraction from his life of wealth and privilege. The Dowager Duchess didn't wait for a response. She turned to her servants, her gaze cold and imperious. "We will take him back to the estate at once," she commanded. "He's been gone too long." Catherine stood frozen, the sting of the words cutting deep. Her mind raced, the images of the man she had grown to care for flashing before her. He was the Duke of Ashford, the very man she had spent days tending to, the man who had made her feel like an equal, even in his silence about his identity. And now he was gone. The Dowager Duchess gave one last, appraising look at Catherine, her lips curling into a thin smile. "You were a useful distraction, I suppose," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But it's time for him to return to his rightful place. He has responsibilities, and you are just a maid." The words stung like acid, and Catherine's stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and betrayal. She had known, even in the quiet moments between them, that their worlds were different. But it was too much. She had given him her care, her attention, and in return, he had allowed her to believe they were equals, that their connection was real. And now, she was nothing more than a fleeting moment in his life. The Dowager Duchess turned to leave, but not before offering one final word. "He'll forget about you in time," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. All this, it was a passing fancy. Catherine's legs nearly buckled beneath her as she closed the door, the sound of the Dowager Duchess's carriage fading into the distance. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving with emotion she couldn't contain. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give in to the weakness of it. She had cared for him, and now she had to let go. The man she had tended to, the man she had come to know as Alexander, was gone, swept back into a world she could never be part of. The ache in her chest was unbearable, but there was nothing she could do. The gap between their lives was too wide, too impossible to bridge. She had been a maid, and he was a duke. That was the truth, and no matter how much she wanted to deny it, it was the only truth that mattered now. The section ended with her standing alone in the quiet of the cottage, her heart shattered, her world upended, and her mind unable to make sense of the cruel reality she now faced. The days that followed were a blur of sorrow and confusion for Catherine. The once quiet cottage now felt like a prison, its walls pressing in on her as she tried and failed to move on. The village gossip spread quickly, as it always did, with whispers of the scandal surrounding the Duke of Ashford's disappearance and his sudden return to his estate. Everyone had an opinion, of course, some sympathetic to Catherine's plight, others amused by her apparent naivety in believing a man of such high rank could ever truly be interested in a common maid. She tried to ignore the stares, the hushed conversations when she passed by the villagers, but it was impossible to escape. It seemed as though the very air she breathed had changed, weighed down by the truth she could no longer deny. She had been nothing more than a temporary distraction, a fleeting moment of warmth in a life that would never include her. But it wasn't just a village that weighed on her heart. It was the ache of her own unspoken feelings. 3 months had passed, and in all that time, not a single word had come from Alexander. She had hoped, deep down, that he would come for her, that he would return and explain himself, that he would somehow bridge the impossible gap between their worlds. But each passing day made it clearer. He had gone back to his life, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. She threw herself into her work at the school, teaching the village children with the same passion she always had, though the joy she once found in it had slowly started to fade. Her lessons were as thoughtful as ever, but the lightness in her heart had dimmed, replaced by a quiet resignation. She had no right to mourn a man who had never truly belonged to her, yet she couldn't help the ache that lingered every time she thought of him. The silence between them felt suffocating, and the memory of his presence, his warmth, his smile, was a constant, painful reminder of what could never be. Alexander, meanwhile, was in the midst of his own turmoil. The Dowager Duchess had made it clear that he was to forget the incident, to move on from a maid who had dared to make him question his position. But Alexander found it impossible to do so. The more he tried to immerse himself in the duties of the estate, the more he realized that his heart wasn't in it. He had never felt so disconnected from the life he had been born into. The cold, calculated world of aristocracy seemed like a distant memory compared to the warmth and simplicity of the cottage where Catherine had cared for him. He had come to care for her deeply, more than he had ever expected. And now that she was gone from his life, he couldn't ignore the gnawing emptiness inside him. The pressure from his mother to marry, to fulfill his role as Duke, only intensified the internal conflict he had been struggling with since his return. He had tried to forget her, to push the memory of the woman who had shown him such kindness and compassion out of his mind. But it was no use. Catherine had changed him in ways he wasn't yet ready to understand, and every moment spent in the lavish halls of Ashford Manor felt like a betrayal to the quiet, genuine connection they had shared. Letters sat in his desk, unsent, words of apology and longing that he could never bring himself to send. He wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to explain everything, that he had never meant to deceive her, that the man she had cared for was a real Alexander, not the title he had inherited. But the fear of rejection, the fear of her seeing him as nothing more than a man bound by duty, kept him silent. So he continued to live in the opulence of Ashford Manor, surrounded by wealth and expectations, yet never feeling further from the life he truly wanted. It was during one of his frequent, restless walks through the estate's gardens that he found himself standing at the edge of the forest, staring out into the distance, wondering if he had lost her forever. He had not seen Catherine since that fateful day when his mother had swept him away, and now he was left with nothing but the memory of her, the memory of a woman who had made him feel seen, not as a duke but as a man. Back at the cottage, Catherine had resigned herself to the reality that Alexander was gone, that he had returned to his life of privilege and expectations. She had to move forward. Even though it felt like a cruel joke, there was no place for her in his world, and in truth, she had always known that, but it didn't make it any easier. The lingering pain in her heart was a constant companion, and the thought of him, of the man she had once tended to, the man who had opened up to her in ways no one ever had, kept her awake at night. She couldn't forget him, not in the way she knew she should. She had tried to bury her feelings, tried to move on, but they had taken root deep within her, a gnawing ache that refused to fade. Both of them were lost in their own worlds, separated by the very thing that had once brought them together, society's expectations. The letters, the unspoken words, the distance between them. It all seemed so insurmountable. But even in the face of all this, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't over. Somewhere in the quiet corners of her heart, she held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, fate had more in store for them. But for now, she could only wait, and so she did, day by day, her heart heavy with unspoken words and a longing that wouldn't let her go. The days passed in silence, both of them carrying the weight of their unspoken truths, unsure where to go from here, but unable to forget the bond they had shared, even as it seemed to slip further out of reach with each passing moment. 3 months had passed, and Catherine had settled into a rhythm, though her heart remained heavy with the memory of Alexander. Life in the village continued as it always had, with its small joys and quiet sorrows, but Catherine had begun to accept that the man she had once nursed back to health was now a distant part of her past. The hope that he might return, that he might explain himself, had slowly faded, replaced by a quiet resignation. But then, one crisp autumn afternoon, as Catherine was teaching the local children outside under the shade of an old oak tree, she saw a figure approach in the distance, riding slowly along the path toward the cottage. At first, she didn't recognize him. It had been months, and the figure seemed too far away to make out clearly. But as the figure drew closer, her heart caught in her chest, and a rush of emotions flooded her. It was Alexander. His face was weary, his posture stiff, but there was no mistaking the man who had once been her patient, her companion, and the one who had left without a word. He had returned, but why? Her hands trembled as she looked at him, unable to move at first. She wasn't sure what she felt, anger, relief, confusion, or all of them at once. He dismounted from his horse with a careful, deliberate motion, and as he walked toward her, Catherine felt the weight of his gaze on her, the same soft intensity that had drawn her in months ago. She stood, not sure if she should speak first or wait for him to explain himself. "Catherine," he said quietly, his voice rough in the long journey, yet full of something she couldn't name. There was no pretense in his words, no formality, just a raw honesty that startled her. "I've made a terrible mistake." She blinked, her pulse quickening as her thoughts raced. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I should never have left like that. I should never have let you think it was over." His words were a balm to the ache in her heart, but they also stirred a bitterness she hadn't expected. He had left her, not just physically, but emotionally, and now he was here, asking for forgiveness, as though he could simply walk back into her life as if nothing had happened. "You have a lot of explaining to do," she said, her voice cold despite the flutter of hope rising in her chest. Alexander nodded, his expression pained. "I know. I wasn't honest with you. I should have told you who I was from the beginning. But I was a fool. I wanted to believe, for once, that I could be just a man, not a duke, not the heir to an estate, not the burden of my title." He stepped closer, and Catherine felt the familiar pull of his presence, the warmth of his gaze, but she forced herself to remain calm, to keep the distance between them. "But I'm not just a man," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm the Duke of Ashford, and I have responsibilities, things I can't escape. But none of that matters when it comes to you." His words hung in the air, and Catherine could feel her heart beating faster, her breath catching in her throat. "Why now?" she asked, unable to stop herself. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" "Because I was afraid," he admitted, his voice softer now, his gaze never leaving hers. "Afraid that you would see me as nothing more than the title, the Duke who was too caught up in his own world to see the person standing before him. But you're the only one who's ever made me feel like I'm more than that. I've spent the last 3 months trying to forget you, trying to move on, but I can't. I can't let you go." Catherine's heart wavered, and for a moment, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes that had been absent during their last meeting. He had been so certain of his place in the world then, so sure of his duty, but now he was here, standing before her as a man who had been humbled by his own feelings, by the connection they had shared. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened," Alexander continued, his voice steady but full of raw emotion. "I just want a chance to show you who I really am, who I could be with you." Catherine didn't know what to say. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, but beneath it all, she knew one thing for certain. She had never stopped caring for him. Despite the hurt, despite the betrayal, she still felt that pull, that unexplainable connection that had been there from the beginning. But could she forgive him? Could she really open her heart to the man who had walked away without a word? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, and Alexander took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if he were afraid she might vanish if he didn't. "Please, Catherine," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I need you. I don't want to live in this world of titles and duty any longer. I want to live in the world you showed me, the world of kindness, of love, of being seen for who I really am." Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope again. She didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment, standing before him, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was worth finding out. Alexander's return marked the beginning of a slow, tentative courtship that neither of them had expected. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of familiarity and awkwardness. Alexander, though a duke, had cast aside the formality of his title to win Catherine's heart again, but he did so with humility that was new to both of them. Every morning, he would visit her at the cottage, bringing small, thoughtful gifts, books to inspire her lessons, teaching supplies for the children she adored, and occasionally flowers from his family's garden. Each gesture, while simple, held a depth of sincerity that spoke louder than any grand declaration could. Catherine was at first reluctant, unsure of how to balance the love that had once been so pure with the reality of their different worlds. She still carried the wound of his earlier departure, still felt the sting of betrayal that he had walked away without explanation, but with each passing day, her resolve weakened. Alexander would sit with her after teaching the children, engaging her in lively conversation about their shared hopes for the future, or their dreams of a better world where kindness and compassion ruled over status and wealth. He listened intently to her ideas, praised her intelligence, and showed a side of himself that made Catherine's heart ache with the recognition of how much he had changed. But it wasn't just his words that drew her in. It was the quiet way he supported her. He offered help at the school, holding classes for the village's young men, even though he had no real skill in teaching. He fumbled through lessons, his noble upbringing hardly equipping him to guide the children, but his efforts were always genuine. The villagers began to notice the change in him, the way he no longer held himself above them, the way he worked alongside Catherine, without pretense. Yet, there were still moments of hesitation, as if neither of them could fully embrace the love that was blooming between them. Catherine found herself torn between the man she had once known and the man he had become. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that his feelings for her were real, that he wasn't just playing at being a common man to fulfill some temporary fantasy. She wasn't sure what to expect, but every day, the feelings she had tried to suppress bubbled to surface, making her heart race when she saw him, making her thoughts scatter whenever he looked at her with those soft, searching eyes. On one of his visits, Alexander took her by surprise with a simple, yet deeply meaningful gesture. After watching her teach the children in the village square, he approached her with a hesitant smile, his hand outstretched. "Catherine," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion, "I know I've caused you pain, and I understand if you can't forgive me, but I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that I care for you. I've always cared for you, and I will never stop." His words, though simple, were everything she needed to hear. Catherine felt her walls crumble as she reached out to take his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch flood through her. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had missed him, how much she had yearned for the connection they had shared. It was as if everything had come full circle. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to smile, the weight of the past lifting just enough to let her heart soar. Yet even as they began to reconnect, a shadow remained between them. The village watched their every move, some with admiration, others with suspicion. The whispers started again, louder this time, as people began to wonder what was really going on between the maid and the Duke. The Dowager Duchess, though still distant, was not pleased with Alexander's newfound affections for a woman of no status. She had made her opinion clear when she had first arrived, and now, from the confines of Ashford Manor, she kept a close eye on her son's every action, sending letters of disapproval to ensure he stayed on the path of responsibility. Alexander's love for Catherine was real, but it came with its own set of challenges. He could feel the weight of his mother's expectations bearing down on him, her voice ringing in his ears whenever he thought of their future together. Yet, As the days turned to weeks, he found himself willing to fight for the life he wanted. A life with Catherine, a life that was about more than titles and duty. He began to visit her more frequently, bringing more gifts, spending more time with the children, and allowing the village to see him as the man he truly was, not just as the Duke of Ashford. But Catherine, ever cautious, still held back. She wasn't sure she could trust that his affections were genuine. She had known him as a man of privilege, a man who had distanced himself from her when it suited him. But this new version of Alexander, the man who worked alongside her, who shared her passion for teaching, who listened to her ideas with rapt attention, was someone she could imagine building a life with. Still, the fear of what their future would hold gnawed at her. Would he be able to truly let go of his responsibilities? Would society accept him? And most importantly, could she trust him again? But even with those questions lingering in her heart, something had shifted. She could no longer deny the feeling she had for him, the way her heart ached for him every time he smiled at her or reached for her hand. Alexander was persistent, patient, and kind, everything she had ever wanted in a man, even though he was more than she ever thought she could have. It was clear that he was willing to fight for her, but whether she was ready to give him that chance was another matter entirely. As they spent more time together, her heart began to open again, slowly but surely. The courtship, though fraught with challenges and uncertainties, felt like the beginning of something beautiful, something worth fighting for. Catherine wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time since Alexander had walked out her life, she allowed herself to believe in their future, in the possibility of love that transcended their worlds. The courtship had only just begun, but for the first time, Catherine felt hopeful. As the days passed, Catherine found herself at a crossroads, torn between her feeling for Alexander and the reality of their differing worlds. The pain of his departure still lingered in her heart, an ache that refused to fade despite his persistent courtship and the tenderness he showed her now. He was a duke, with a life and responsibilities that she could never be a part of. Yet in his eyes, she saw a man who longed for something more, something beyond the obligations of his title. She spent countless hours contemplating her decision, sitting by the fire, thinking about what it would mean to truly give her heart to him. Could she live a life of constant scrutiny, living in the shadow of his title, knowing that society would never fully accept her? And yet, every time Alexander came to her, each gesture, each word he spoke seemed to make those questions feel less important. He had shown her a side of him that was genuine, something real and untainted by the grandeur of his title. His kindness, his laughter, the way he spoke of their future together. It was all so clear, so pure, that Catherine couldn't help but feel a deep connection to him that transcended rank or position. But the weight of her own insecurities held her back. What would his family say? What would the villagers think? She couldn't bear the thought of becoming the subject of gossip, of having her every move scrutinized as a commoner who had captured the heart of a duke. She had lived a life of quiet dignity, where she had never been judged for anything other than her actions. But this was different. Being with Alexander would mean opening herself to a life of judgment and expectation. As the village looked on, some with admiration and others with disdain, Catherine was forced to reckon with the truth. Her love for him was undeniable, but was it enough to overcome the gulf between them? She couldn't deny the love she had for Alexander, nor the way her heart raced whenever he was near. He was different from the man who had walked away from her, the man who had left her to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. This man, the one who had returned to her, was sincere, determined, and willing to fight for her, to fight for them. He had made it clear that he wanted her in his life, that he wanted to build a future with her, regardless of the challenges they would face. As Catherine stood at the threshold of a future she had never dared to imagine, she realized that the decision was hers to make. She didn't have to be afraid anymore. She didn't have to be bound by the expectations of society, by the roles others had forced upon her. She was more than her station, more than her past, and for the first time in her life, she felt empowered to choose her own path. With a deep breath, Catherine made her decision. She would take the leap, would embrace the life Alexander offered her, even if it meant stepping into a world that would always be uncertain, always be filled with challenges. But she was ready to face them, with Alexander by her side. He had shown her that love could exist beyond titles, beyond boundaries, and she was ready to take that step, to walk forward into a future where they would face whatever came together. With the quiet resolve of a woman who had long been underestimated, Catherine made her decision. She would marry him. She would become the Duchess of Ashford, not because of his title, but because of the man he had proven himself to be. The decision, once so difficult, was now clear. She had found her place beside him, and together they would build a life that was theirs, not defined by the past, but by the future they would create. The engagement, once so uncertain, was now a promise of a life full of love, of challenges, but most of all, of the undeniable bond they shared. And with that, Catherine took the final step toward a future she had once thought impossible, her heart finally free to embrace the love she had fought so hard to find. The wedding was a small, intimate affair held at the modest village church where Catherine had spent so many hours teaching the children, where her heart had always felt most at home. The simplicity of the ceremony, with its fragrant wildflowers and humble pews, was a stark contrast to the grandeur that could have been. Catherine, dressed in a simple gown of soft ivory, felt no less beautiful for its lack of elaborate lace or jewels. Her beauty lay in the sincerity of the vows she was about to make. Alexander, dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit that spoke of his nobility without flaunting it, stood beside her, his eyes filled with admiration and love, his hand steady in hers. The villagers, those who had once whispered about their connection, now watched with a mixture of awe and quiet acceptance, as if witnessing a love story they had only dared to dream of. The celebration afterwards, though modest compared to the opulent balls of high society, was filled with warmth, laughter, and a sense of community. Yet, the true test of their union would not come from the village or the modest gathering. They were stepping into a world far more complex, a world that would challenge them both. The estate that Catherine now found herself a part of was grand beyond her wildest imagination, filled with rooms that stretched on forever, hallways that seemed to echo with the weight of history, and servants whose every movement seemed choreographed to perfection. The vastness of Ashford Manor overwhelmed her, its opulence contrasting sharply with the simple life she had known. But Alexander's presence beside her was a steady anchor, reminding her that this was now her home, too. The adjustment was not easy. Catherine, with her deep love for the land and its people, had always found meaning in the everyday acts of kindness and care. Now, in the manor, she was expected to embrace the role of a duchess, a figurehead of society, someone who needed to navigate the complex rules and expectations of the elite. Yet, her heart yearned to make real, lasting change, to help the tenants, to improve their living conditions, to establish programs for education, just as she had done in the village. Slowly, she began to implement changes at Ashford Manor, starting with the tenants who worked on the estate. She offered them better housing, fairer wages, and opportunities for their children to attend school. Alexander, despite the resistance from some of his peers, supported her every step of the way, knowing that her ideas, though unconventional for a duchess, would leave a lasting legacy. Over time, some members of high society began to accept her, though not without grumbling. The Dowager Duchess, still disapproving of her son's marriage to a woman of no title, watched from the shadows, her cold disapproval never far from Catherine's mind. Yet, even the Dowager's criticisms couldn't deter her. Catherine had come to see herself not as a figure of charity, but as someone who could bring real, lasting change, someone whose heart was as much a part of the estate as its bricks and mortar. She found her place among the other women of society, slowly earning their respect not because of her title, but because of her compassion, her intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to the well-being of those who had once been overlooked. Her efforts to improve the lives of the less fortunate were not always met with applause, but as the months passed, Catherine saw the impact she was having. The tenants were healthier, the children better educated, and the estate was beginning to thrive in ways it never had before. And at the end of each day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander would return to her side, his arm around her waist, and they would stand together, overlooking the estate they were building together. The first year of their marriage was a slow, sometimes painful process of adapting, of learning to balance the expectations of their roles with the lives they wanted to live. Yet, as Catherine looked out over the land she had come to love, she realized that the challenges were not burdens to bear, but opportunities to build something lasting, something that could transcend the rigid boundaries of social class. With Alexander at her side, She knew that together, they could create a life that was defined not by tradition or expectation, but by love, kindness, and a belief that they could make a difference in the world around them. The manor, once a symbol of everything that had separated them, had become a place where their shared vision could flourish. The storm of doubt and fear that had once clouded their relationship had passed, and now, standing together, Catherine and Alexander knew they had only just begun. Their journey had only just begun. 5 years had passed since Catherine had become the Duchess of Ashford, and as she stood at the edge of the meadow overlooking their estate, she marveled at how much had changed, not just within the grand walls of Ashford Manor, but within herself and the community she had come to love. The house that once felt cold and alien had become a home, not only for her and Alexander, but for the many lives they had touched. Their 2 children, a son and a daughter, ran across the lawn, their laughter filling the air, and Catherine couldn't help but smile. The quiet legacy they had begun together was slowly taking root, its roots deep in the hearts of the villagers who now saw them not as figures of aristocracy, but as partners, mentors, and friends. The estate, once a symbol of old-world wealth and privilege, had become a beacon of progress, with new educational programs, improved health care for the tenants, and the promise of a better life for future generations. Catherine's dream of transforming Ashford Manor into a place where kindness and opportunity took precedence over tradition was becoming a reality. They had started small: better housing for the workers, fair wages, scholarships for children. But those small steps had led to something far greater. The land they cultivated together was not just fertile with crops, but with ideas, and Catherine's heart swelled with pride when she saw how far they had come. Every improvement made to the estate was a testament to the partnership she had built with Alexander, a partnership rooted in love, mutual respect, and shared vision. Even now, as the world outside continued to evolve, Ashford Manor remained a haven for those who had long been forgotten, a place where the lines of class and privilege were blurred, and people were judged not by their titles, but by their character. Catherine had never imagined herself in such a role, but as she watched her children play with the same joy she had once known in the village, she realized that her purpose had always been to serve others, to build a life that would be remembered for its kindness and its willingness to fight for what was right. Alexander stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his presence a quiet comfort, as it always had been. His love for her had never wavered, and over the years, they had become a team, a force for change that was both powerful and gentle. His pride in her was evident every time he spoke of her to others, not as the Duchess, but as the woman who had changed their world. Together, they had created something lasting, a legacy of compassion that would endure long after they were gone. As Catherine stood there, with the wind rustling through the trees and her children's laughter echoing in the distance, she knew that they had built something far more meaningful than a title or a grand estate. They had built a future where love and kindness were the cornerstones, and where the impact of their efforts would ripple out far beyond the walls of Ashford Manor. They had made a difference, and that was a true legacy they would leave behind. Alexander handed her a small, weathered box, its contents wrapped in the same simple cloth that had marked their first meeting. As she opened it, a small, handwritten letter slipped out, one that had been written in the early days of their marriage but had never been sent. It was a letter Alexander had written to her before he left, a letter of love, of regret, and of the promise he had made to return. In his own words, she could hear the sincerity that had drawn them together, the quiet ache he had carried for so long. She held the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of his words, and smiled. This, she thought, was a testament to their love, a love that had endured, transformed, and grown stronger with time. The storm of the past was long gone, and now they stood together, side by side, watching the future unfold before them. Their legacy had only just begun. 5 years had passed, and Catherine and Alexander had created a life together that neither had thought possible in the early days of their relationship. The trials they had faced, the doubts, the fears of their differences, all seemed like distant memories now, as they stood together on the very land that had once seemed to divide them. A fresh September storm was rolling in, clouds darkening the sky in much the same way they had on the night they first met. But this time, there was no fear, no uncertainty, only the quiet hum of life moving forward. Alexander and Catherine had come a long way from the first night. He had collapsed at her doorstep, fevered and disoriented. Their love had been tested, tried by the weight of society's expectations, but had only grown stronger. Standing together on the estate now, surrounded by their children and the legacy of what they had built, they had become more than they had ever imagined. The storm clouds rolled in fast, the wind picking up once again, but it didn't bring the same sense of dread as it once had. The fields and meadows of Ashford Manor had flourished under Catherine's guidance, the children of the village now benefiting from the education she had worked so hard to establish. Alexander had come to support her, not as a ruler, but as an equal, giving her the freedom to shape their world in a way that aligned with her values of compassion and kindness. He had stepped away from the rigid expectations of his title, choosing a life that meant more to him than power or wealth. And Catherine had found herself in a position of influence, not because of her birth, but because of the love and dedication she had poured into their shared vision. As the storm approached, Catherine's heart swelled with the weight of the life they had created, the family they had nurtured together, and the community they had worked to transform. Their children, Jack, now a bright-eyed young boy with an inquisitive mind, and Emma, their daughter, who had inherited Catherine's quiet strength, played nearby, running through the meadow as the first raindrops began to fall. Their laughter filled the air, as it always had, and for a brief moment, Catherine allowed herself to bask in the simple beauty of it all. They had made it through the storms, not just the ones that had raged outside, but the emotional ones that had threatened to tear them apart. The road they had traveled had not been easy, but it had been worth it. Alexander stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, looking out at the estate with pride. They had built something real here, something that had weathered the storms of time and would continue to grow long after they were gone. And as the wind picked up, the clouds darkening overhead, Catherine couldn't help but smile, remembering the night they had first met. The storm had brought them together then, and now it was as if the storm had come full circle, bringing with it a new beginning. But this time, they were not alone, and they were not afraid. As the storm continued to gather in the distance, a figure appeared on the path leading to the cottage. Catherine's heart skipped a beat, a familiar feeling rising within her. The figure was a young man, running frantically toward the shelter of the cottage, drenched by the rain and struggling against the powerful wind. As he approached, she saw the same frantic look in his eyes that had once mirrored Alexander's. He collapsed at the door, just as Alexander had done all those years ago, and Catherine's instinct kicked in. Without hesitation, she rushed him, just as she had with Alexander, her hands moving with practiced precision to check his pulse, to feel his forehead, to steady him. Alexander followed her, his expression a mixture of concern and recognition. "Catherine," he said softly, his voice filled with understanding. "It's just like before." She looked up at him, the weight of the moment sinking in. The world they had built, the legacy of kindness and compassion, had come full circle. It was not just about them anymore, but about helping others, about showing that love and care could heal even the deepest wounds. As she tended to the young man, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was her purpose. This was what they had created. She and Alexander had gone through their own trials, their own storms, but now they were in a position to offer help to others, to pass on the lessons they had learned through their own struggles. The young man stirred slightly, his eyes flickering open, and Catherine smiled softly, her hand still resting gently on his forehead. She turned to Alexander, who was watching her with quiet admiration, the same way he had all those years ago. "We've come a long way," she whispered, "but there's still so much more to do." Alexander nodded, his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "Together, we'll keep going. We'll make sure the legacy we leave behind is one of love, compassion, and change." The young man slowly regained consciousness, and Catherine's heart swelled with pride as she helped him sit up, offering him the same care and warmth she had given Alexander when it first come to her. This was their life now, given to others, showing kindness, and continuing the work they had started. As the rain began to pour in earnest, the storm outside seemed almost distant, a mere backdrop to the life they had created. Standing there in the warmth of their home, surrounded by the people they loved, Catherine knew that their love would continue to transform lives, just as it had transformed theirs. They had weathered the storms, and now they were ready for whatever came next. The storm, though fierce, would not last. Just as they had learned to navigate the difficult times, they would face the future with strength, with love, and with a belief that no matter challenges, their legacy would endure. As the storm raged on outside, Catherine and Alexander stood together, watching over the young man they had saved, knowing that they had given him the same gift that had been given to them, a chance at a new beginning. And in that moment, they knew that the love they shared and the work they had done would ripple outward, creating a legacy of kindness and transformation that would last long after they were gone. Their love had not only saved them, but had now become a beacon for others to follow. Catherine and Alexander stood together in the storm, watching over another soul being saved, proving that love could transform not just individuals, but the world.